Bulasi'a. Nā ia rango Alice te punga Samovo. O iau nā marama ni Taranaki, nungu matangali te Ātiawa. Ao wakawati i nā koro ko Vunikondi, e nā tikina ko Undu, e nā ia sano o Madawata. Tēnā koutou. Thank you to Talatala Livani for inviting me to share some brief thoughts about some research I've been doing about Indigenous writing. And I'm sharing these thoughts in solidarity and celebration with the Fijian community, celebrating Fiji Language Week this week in 2021. I'm a Māori person, so why am I speaking about Fiji Language Week? There's a couple of reasons. One of them is that as a Māori person, I know the experience of not speaking language and the way that the language can fall out of a community with just one generation of parents not speaking to their children. But it takes 3 to 4 generations for the language to come back into the community to be spoken with true fluency again. So as a Māori person, it's important to me to also stand in solidarity with our cousins from around Te Mananui-a-Kiwa, and to encourage others to learn from our experience, which has been a hard and sad experience of having to work really, really hard to save our language from the point of critical endangerment that it was in for a period of time through the 70s and 80s. And to some extent is still endangered today. But I'm also interested in this topic of Fijian language because of some research I've been doing. I teach at the University of Waikato in the Pacific and Indigenous Studies area. And one of the things I've been working on is a project focused on writing by Indigenous people in Aotearoa, Fiji, Hawaii and Australia. And one of the reasons I'm interested in that is that I think that when we understand the writing that our ancestors have done, it's another way for us to connect with who we are. And I guess that's the main idea that I wanted to contribute as you celebrate Fiji Language Week, is the idea that often we focus on the really beautiful and amazing and diverse ways that our languages are spoken, that our languages are heard, that our languages are sung, that they're used in ceremony, how they look when they're written, how they sound when they're written maybe isn't something that we talk about. We often don't think about our Indigenous languages being written languages, or the writing that's in our languages. Even though we are familiar with some parts of our written languages, and in the Fijian context, obviously, people are used to the idea that there's Fiji language Bibles and there's Fiji language religious materials, and maybe that there's some Fiji language newspapers or magazines, and that there's Fijian language that's used on social media all the time, in text messages and private messages and so on. But one of the things that research like mine does is it contributes to our thinking about who we are as Indigenous people by focusing on that writing. And the reason for that is that because our communities have been told through the process of colonialism, hey, you guys aren't readers and writers, but also your knowledges, your values, your histories, they don't matter, or they're not as complex or as robust or strong as other people's histories and perspectives and knowledges and science and poetry and so on. But of course, what we find when we go to archives and libraries and family collections is that Indigenous people have been writing all around the Pacific region, including in Aotearoa, and particularly including in Fiji, for well over a century. We can think about writers like Epeli Rokowanga from Bau in Tailevu, who was a student at Navuloa when he wrote a manuscript that has been published as Viti Makawa. And in 2013, it turned from being just sitting in the archives to something that you could buy as a book, Viti Makawa, after it was translated by Kolonio Meo. And in this writing, what we see is somebody in the 19th century in Fiji thinking about what it is to be Fijian, and recording histories, cultural knowledge, scientific knowledge, and so on. Actually, from the 19th century all the way through, from like the 1870s, 1880s, for 100 years, there was a monthly newspaper, colonial office newspaper called Ngā Mata. Some of you may be familiar with that newspaper. And what we find is every single month there's writing in there by Fijian people in the Fijian language. The entire newspaper was in Fijian. And across all of those issues of that newspaper, we find Indigenous Fijian people writing in Fijian, writing letters to the editor. Ratu ngā mata, they write, and then they share their ideas or their thoughts or their concerns or whatever. What we find is we find Fijian people writing in Fijian different poetry, translations of other kinds of writing. So from 1902, there was a translation of Sinbad the Sailor and some of the other Arabian Nights. And so we can imagine, ancestors in Fiji reading every month, getting another snippet of this translation of Sinbad the Sailor. These translations actually, all the way through the 20th century, Fijian people were translating all kinds of novels and books, religious texts and so on, from other languages, mostly English, into Fijian. In the 1970s, there's another explosion in the writing in the Fijian language. And some of that is because there was a whole explosion of Fijian people doing really cool things with writing in English. And it kind of flowed between English and Fijian. So in English, we might think of something like this by Joe Nadola. This came out in 1976. He was a playwright, and this was some plays that he wrote, I Native No More. But as well as this kind of bubble of writing that came up all around the region, all around the places I'm looking at in my research, Aotearoa, Hawaii, Fiji, Australia, there was also an explosion of writing in the Fijian language, and perhaps the best example of that is a little collection of short stories written in Fijian by people who were attending a teacher's college. The book's called Tō Lea, and it's really interesting because people are using Fijian in ways that they hadn't used it before, trying to find new ways to be creative with the language. People continue to write in the Fijian language. And so when we're thinking about what we celebrate when we're celebrating Fiji Language Week, we can celebrate the writing, and we can celebrate that Indigenous people are writers and Indigenous people are readers, and have been for a long time. One of the reasons that this is important to me, and why I was keen to share some of my thoughts, is that we need Fijian researchers to work with this writing. There are not enough researchers who have proficiency in the Fijian language to work with all of these texts. Hardly anybody has done any research at all on Ngā Mata, which has come out every single month for a century. There is so much Fiji language writing there. And we need researchers, we need people to do master's degrees and undergraduate degrees and PhDs and to be academics, historians, literary scholars, people who are interested in language and culture. And so when you're thinking about the future for your own kids or for yourselves, please consider that we need people to do this work. We need the descendants, broadly speaking, of these Fiji language writers to engage the work. Otherwise, all of that work that our ancestors have done by writing these things sort of ends up going to waste because no one's out there to read it. This brings us to the second point, which ties back to Fiji Language Week. If we're going to have Fijian people as researchers who can work with this work, we need Fijian people to speak Fijian. And this is really important in the context of New Zealand. As I said earlier, it only takes one generation to lose a language. So parents not speaking to the children, and unfortunately your kids being able to understand you doesn't mean that they can speak the language. It just means they can understand the language. they are not going to know the language well enough to pass it on to the next generation. So the question to ask is, are the kids speaking to each other in the language? Because when they grow up and become adults, and in the future when they're the elders, the language they're speaking now with each other is the language they're going to speak to each other in the future. If they're speaking English to each other all the time now, then the language will drop out of the family. I know that sounds dramatic, but what's important is that we think about the need for ourselves to speak to our children in Fijian, to value the language, to value it as a spoken, a heard, and I'm arguing, also a written and a read language, a language which is beautiful and which we don't want to lose. The reason then that we celebrate Fiji Language Week, the reason that we try to remind ourselves to speak Fijian, to speak our Indigenous languages to our children, is that ultimately this is a gift to our grandchildren, to ensure that our children will pass on all of the things that come with the language to them. On that note, happy Fiji Language Week. Kia ora.